Exposure is a poem about the First World War. You can think about the title of the poem and think about what exposure actually means. There's a couple of meanings that you could think of. One is the harmful effects of extreme cold. It's an actual medical condition to be exposed. If you were on a mountain for a couple of days, then you might be suffering from exposure. Or you can think about exposure as being the state of being exposed, either physically or mentally. The poem Exposure was written by Wilfred Owen, who was an English poet whose work was characterised by his anger at the cruelty and the waste of war. He actually experienced the war himself and became a soldier, but after experiencing heavy fighting in 1917, he was diagnosed with shell shock and was evacuated to England, where he arrived at Craiglockhart War Hospital in June of 1917. He met Siegfried Sassoon, another English war poet there, who already had a reputation as a poet, and he helped him to create some of his impressive works. He returned to France the following year, and just before the end of the First World War, he was killed. And the news of his death reached his parents on the 11th of November, when the First World War ended. The poem looks at what happens to the men suffering as the poem progresses. It's one day in the life of the trenches. It's a chronological story with the themes of the weather, the harsh conditions, the surroundings, the events, and the feelings that the men would have had, the boredom and the despair, the hopelessness, the separation from humanity. There is a regular verse and rhyme which adds to the feeling of repetitiveness and gives you the impression of the men's boredom at being in this situation. The short final line is thought-provoking and makes you think about what was going through their heads. There is few overt mentions of war. It's not mentioned specifically, but there are lots and lots of language techniques, such as metaphor, simile, sibilance, personification, alliteration, questions that make you think about what it would have been like. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. It's full of sibilance, it's full of this S sound, which makes it sound cold and oppressive, as like nature has turned against them. The personification of the winds that knife us adds to this sense of pain and suffering, and the ellipsis at the end suggests that it is going on and will keep going on forever. Worried we keep awake because the night is silent. The men are worried by the silence. It's unexpected in a war to have this silence. The low drooping flares confuse our memory. They're confused about what is reality. And the final line of the stanza, "but nothing happens," which is repeated 4 times in the poem, gives you an impression of their boredom and how monotonous the whole thing is, which only adds to their terror and their fear. They hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, and that personification of the wind gives you an impression that they themselves could perhaps be going mad. The brambles is a metaphor for the wire, the barbed wire that would have been used, and it seems that the soldiers are actually quite far away from the fighting. They hear the guns and they feel distant to what is going on, which conveys their despair in the situation at what they are actually doing there. The misery, or the misery that they feel, is mirrored by the weather. War lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy, and the alliteration there adds to this sense of despair. Dawn, which should be a time of hope, here represents death, and we see the personification of how dawn brings in her melancholy army and attacks in ranks on shivering ranks of grey, which gives an impression of the reality of the situation. The sibilance of sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, echoes the sound of the bullets whizzing past the men's ears. But The poet refers to that as being less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. So the bullets and the fighting is less deadly than the weather. The poet seems to be immune to bullets, perhaps suggesting a loss of humanity. The snow, which is usually white, equaling purity, is here black, suggesting that now even nature has been corrupted. Flowing flakes that flock is alliteration, suggesting that the snow is endless. The pale flakes with fingering stealth that come feeling for our faces is more personification, suggesting that the weather is seeking them out. We cringe in holes, suggesting they're reduced to an animal-like state, and they have forgotten dreams. Hope is far away. Deep into grassier ditches, so we drowse sundoze. The alliteration of the D sound strengthens the state of despair. And the enjambment used in this stanza heightens the confused feeling that the persona and the soldiers are feeling. Slowly our ghost drag home gives it a dream-like state. The shutters and the doors are all closed, suggesting perhaps a lack of understanding from loved ones at home, and the fact that there is no way back from war, their dreams are futile. We turn back to our dying. They seem to be stuck between life and death, in a limbo state, where they can't become the people that they once used to be. The reference to God suggests that their old beliefs are fading. They can't retain their old identities because the atrocities that they have committed or the atrocities that they've seen. And it's a very dehumanizing experience for them. Tonight his frost will fasten on this mud and us, shriveling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp, suggesting the weather is deadlier than the war, maybe even blaming God for this. The burying party picks and shovels in their shaking grass, pause over half-known faces, but there seems to be little room for grief. All the eyes in these dead bodies are ice, suggesting lack of emotion, being no longer human. And the poem ends with, but nothing happens. It ends in the same way, because nothing has happened. It all seems pointless and futile. A possible question for this could be explain and analyse how Owen presents the horror of war and exposure. And you could think about the structure, but nothing happens, and how that is continually repeated. You could think particularly about the poetic devices in this poem, and how they are used to suggest the horror, or used to suggest how the soldiers are feeling.